We got down to 34 here down in Lakeville.
We have some roots that are only sort of friendship roots at this point in Minnesota with my mom's side. And my mom now lives in Wisconsin. So we're kind of, this is sort of Twin Cities, right? Isn't your club Twin Cities Club? Or is this?
All of Twin Cities, but it's all of Minnesota.
It's all of Minnesota, right? Okay. All right.
Out on here, and I think you got a Rochester.
Okay.
This makes it easier for those people that are out of the metro. So.
Okay.
I am going. Sorry.
I'm going to mute everybody and then turn myself and Michael back on, just because the background noise is.
Yeah.
All right, here we go. Oh.
Okay.
Uh-oh. Can't seem to unmute you, Michael.
I can do that. There. Yeah, sorry. All right. We're going to figure this out. Is Mary Graham on? Is she here? Can you say hello if you are?
I don't think she usually comes to...
Is she a member of your club? Okay, she might. Is there another club she might be a member of? I thought she was Twin Cities.
You talking about your editor, Mary?
Yes, my editor for Bonsai Heresy is from your...
Cheryl, you're muted.
What's that?
It's Mary Russell.
Yeah, Mary Russell.
Mary Russell, that's right. Yeah.
She doesn't come to our...
Oh, okay.
Anymore. I'm not even sure she's a club member anymore.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Best not get into long stories.
Uh-oh. Well, she did a great job on the book.
She's a good editor.
Yeah. Yeah, she was amazing.
I'm going to get started, and I'll be fumbling around getting the slides on for a second. So.
Mm-hmm. Oh boy. Reverend Monk? Oh dear. Oh no.
We'll get to that. All right. So.
Funny.
Sorry, I lost my, we are going to record. I lost my recording button.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's bad. No, it's just one of those days. Hang on. Stop sharing. I'm seeing if I can start it this way. Ah, yes. Okay. All right. Well, we'll get started. I think I started the recording, but I will double check.
Yep, you're recording.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
All right, upcoming events. We do have some upcoming events. Fundamentals class with Peter T. We have a tentative dates of March 27th and 28th and October 9th and 10th. These aren't set in stone yet, but we should know in the next week or so, and people who are taking those classes will be notified soon. No Bonsai Basics in January, February.
Your part.
Everybody mute. Thank you. Bonsai Basics, no meeting. Bonsai.
Carol, I'm unmuting myself just to say that we can't see your screen right now.
Oh.
Sorry. And I'm remuting.
All right, I screwed up. Let me start this over again. I don't usually have such a problem here. So we'll stop the recording and start it over. Okay, this time I'll try again. Now we do, right? There we go. Okay. So,
great.
Upcoming events, Fundamentals with Peter T. Now you can see it. March 27th, 9th, and 8th. We don't know for 100% sure, but in the next week or so, Dale will be notifying people who are taking those classes. Bonsai Basics as usual, nothing in January, February. Bonsai Concepts, Dale is planning some things, and check the newsletter as usual or emails if he sends them out. This year is going to be interesting. Happy 2021, everyone. Since we don't know exactly what's going to be allowed in terms of meeting and everything, I've just roughed out tentatively what I'm thinking, and that is that we'll continue to do Zoom through April, and then venues outdoors start to open up. I will warn you, I've had a lot of trouble getting places because there's a lot of other people desiring outdoor meeting venues and weddings and everything. So we'll see. And then head back into Gloria Day for by September, I am hoping. So we'll see. And without any more ado, I'm delighted to introduce you to Michael Hagadorn, who I've known for several years, having studied with him in Oregon at his seasonal classes. And the bio in your email explained a lot more about him, but I'll tell you little things. And that is that he was formerly a bonsai potter, and then started studying with Boone and then Shinji Suzuki, as you know, in Japan. He currently lives in a tiny house and is broadcasting from there. Sorry, I mistook it for a closet.
An easy mistake to make.
200 square feet, right?
Yeah.
In addition to the 2 books that he has written and published, one being the post-dated, what is it, the something of a irreverent monk.
The schooling of an irreverent bonsai monk.
All right. And he also has given the course, one of the Bonsai Empire classes. He did the fundamentals. That really goes beautifully through some of the aesthetic nuances that Michael's so good at and well known for. He's now teaching his seasonals classes as Seasonals Light through Zoom, which is wonderful for people like us from Minnesota and other people far from Oregon. And if you haven't purchased Michael's book yet and you're inspired to afterwards, just go on the website to Stone Lantern is where they're being sold. And without much ado, I will pin you and you can get started. Yeah. Uh-oh. Yeah, I'm trying to get you spotlighted, not just pinned.
I can do it, Carol, too.
Spotlighted.
I got it.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
Yeah, that worked briefly. So I can share, right? Let's see. Everybody see that?
Yep.
Yeah, we're good.
Yep.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Well, thank you, Carol. And it's nice to be talking with you tonight. It's 5 o'clock my time. And I've had a lot of fun with Zoom over the last year, teaching the seasonal lights. We've had students from Australia and Costa Rica and South Africa and places that you normally don't get within 1 year. but it was super fun to make lots of connections and friends in far-flung places. And I haven't been in Minnesota in a very long time. But I met Cheryl and was in her backyard some years ago, and have enjoyed having Carol out many times for the seasonals. So many of the things in this book, Bonsai Heresy, which was just published this year, came out of the seasonal classes, questions from astute students, and many of them I couldn't answer. And so the chapters in this book, which I'm calling myths, many of them came out of investigations or things that I didn't understand well myself, even after coming back from Japan, especially many of the ones that revolved or hinged on science. And so there's a good chunk of the book, maybe even a third of the book, which is sort of science related, and then a whole lot of the book is where science can't touch anything, and that's another big chunk of the book. And then it's split in half as another way to kind of understand the book into technical and aesthetic myths. And I've done the same thing with this presentation here today. So on the back cover, I have this quote by Mark Twain, who gave us so many wonderful quotes. But when I read this, it was actually a funny story, because we were seeking something. I was some sort of an image or something like that made sense of the whole book. And my former apprentice, Andrew Robson, was in the room, and he started looking for just quotes and found this one from Mark Twain. When I read it, I knew it was the perfect one because it really felt like that the quote summed up my experience in writing this book. So the first part of this are technical myths. And this is the first chapter. Bonsai methods should be exclusively based on science. So anything in this presentation in quotations is an ironic phrase that is the chapter title from one of the chapters of the book. So I don't believe this. I think this is incorrect. Science is very useful, however. It's not everything. To the right, so on the second part of each of these segments, to the right, I'm going to be sharing some of the sort of bullet points of the chapter, and to the left are some of these amazing illustrations that Sergio Kwan did. I laughed every time that he sent me one of these last year when we were piecing all this together. I'm sorry, it was 2019. Excuse me. But he's an animator by trade, and this was a fun project for him to work in a slightly different way. And I was really humbled to be working with him. He's really talented. Okay, so as far as content, science is definitely useful, and I come from a background of science. My father was a scientist, and I have a minor in biology. And so I kind of came at Bonsai assuming that science was going to be my best friend. And as it turned out, it it was maybe an acquaintance. And what I learned in Japan was that bonsai tradition is really created by stories, created by anecdote, created by people who were trying some things, and then somebody said to somebody else, hey, actually this really worked, why don't you try it too? And so rather than sort of a scientific method, it was this trial and error over centuries. And that's sort of what created bonsai tradition and is still creating bonsai tradition. Science is useful when it comes to helping us understand things like hormones and why when we cut a plant, it responds the way it does according to when we cut it. It's helpful to understand how fertilization can improve the planting and can, if we understand that more intimately, improve the techniques and the timing of the techniques that we use on our trees. Unfortunately, science and anecdote are paired with fantasy, which we're all pretty involved with and have a lot of fun with, and that is the invention of story in the absence of information. And I've certainly had my fun with that as well. And I have a number of stories about my adventures in fantasy in Bonsai Heresy. But I did want to conclude this section by saying that we're all part of this tradition. Some of tradition is actually really recent. A lot of the defoliation techniques are from the 20th century. This isn't something that goes back hundreds of years. I had originally thought that black pine decandling was from the early 70s because I kept hearing that, but I had never actually gone to figure out any kind of primary source about that. And one of my editors for the book was Jonas Dupuy, and we had a lot of fun with that particular one of black pine decandling. We finally found an answer in a book that we had to have translated, but it was of Sachi Suzuki. So this has nothing to do with my teacher, Shinji Suzuki. Different. It's as common a name as Jones in Japan, and we discovered that it was actually not from the 70s, this technique, but he actually discovered this technique in the late 1930s, much earlier than I had ever, and I think most of us had ever thought that it had occurred. So tradition is an evolving thing, and keep careful notes. You can help us. Carol, did we have any questions come through? We were going to do questions sort of as we finish each segment here. You there, Carol?
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry, I was trying
to.
Yeah,
there she is. Hi there.
Yeah, feel free to type questions, everybody. They haven't started yet.
Okay. Yeah, use your chat, which is what is this little bottom bar there?
Yes, and a lot of people have read your book, and maybe if you have thought of questions in advance, feel free to do them, and I will ask them every time you wonder.
Yeah, anytime they come up, I'll give a pause, and then I'll punt to you, Carol, at the end of each little section. If we have a question, that's great. If not, I'll just keep moving, and then we can always cover general questions at the end as well. So here's another chapter. These aren't sequential in the book, but they're related to the illustrations, actually. So there is, as many of you know, kind of a fist fight over chemical versus organic fertilizers and which are better. And this was one of the topics that came up in the years that I've come back from Japan. I came back in 2006. And I realized in the first few years that I really didn't have an answer. I didn't really know. I had used organic in Japan exclusively. We didn't use any chemical fertilizers at all, but I didn't know if that was based on anything that related to bonsai aesthetics, or what was it easier, or what was going on there. So in the research that I did, following that questioning years ago, and even more when I was writing the book, I interviewed a horticulturalist up in Seattle who said a nutrient is a nutrient is a nutrient. And I thought that was a pretty good phrasing. What she was saying was that plants can use both sources equally well. It doesn't matter where the source comes from. But it doesn't mean that organic and chemical are the same. They're certainly applied differently. The numbers can be dramatically different. And then there's just simple practical matters, because cakes, unless you have animal problems, and many people do, cakes are really easy to use. You put a certain number on for a few trees that need a certain kind of care, and you put more on or less on for those that don't. So you can see how much you're fertilizing, and it's a slow release. Every time we water a lot, so we're flushing out a lot. And if all we're using is an inorganic, that often flushes out, especially if you're using mineral soils, as the Japanese do, that flushes out quickly, and then you get sort of a feast-famine effect. Cakes make sense. It's a pretty smart thing. If you get a lot of rain, at the end of the rain, you have the same amount of fertilizer in the pot as if you're using cakes as at the beginning of the rain. So there's some cleverness to it. So another thing I was curious about is, well, if even if we could handle the inorganic well, and even if we can handle it during times of the year when we might not want to water it in, such as when it's raining a lot and we don't want to wet it even more, which is the way that we apply that. If it's a liquid, I mean. Then is there a difference between organics and chemicals? And so we did a little test in our backyard, and I think more tests of this nature really have to be done. It's only one example, but we did find that organics create slightly shorter internodes, and definitely create a kind of a slower growth habit, which is sort of what we want for mature bonsai. We don't want rambunctiousness. So that was an interesting finding, and the details of that are in the book. But Carol, did any questions come through?
Yes.
Through chat?
Do you use chemical fertilizers? And if so, which ones?
Yeah, we have used them. Yeah, absolutely. We do use primarily organics, primarily fish. I would use cakes if I could, but we have some problems in my backyard, one of which is a lot of dryness. We're drier here than you probably are there in the summer. It becomes kind of a desert here in Western Oregon. So we found that cakes weren't all that effective because they have to be broken down by bacteria. So we do need to water things in, and we have used inorganics. We have used things like Dynagrow, which is a pretty mild one. I think that's a pretty good one. Also, don't ignore things like Osmocote or Apex, which is a little pellet fertilizer. Lasts for about 4 months. Just be careful. Maybe note on the calendar when you put it on, because they can disappear inside the soil or the moss, and it can be hard to remember what you put on and when and how much. So they're not quite as effective as cakes. You can't take it off when you don't want it. You can't easily play with it, but it's something to consider. I would use a little caution with chemicals, but they can be useful for sure. Dynagrow has a very broad spectrum of micronutrients, and we found that things like chochibai, which like a lot of nutrition and not just the macros, they need a lot of the micros, or so it seems. They seem to be much happier with that. That a little bit of Dynagrow or something like that seems pretty happy for them. So they have their uses. In Japan, they do use some chemicals, but it's almost entirely cakes over there.
You mentioned shorter internodes. Is it shorter internodes and more buds on particular types of trees like pines, junipers, and deciduous, or does it matter?
That's a really good question. I think that's something that needs to be answered by more citizen science experiments. Yeah. I don't think we're going to get a scientist interested in doing this unless they already do bonsai. So citizen science experiments in our backyard, or tests, I should say, are probably the way to answer that question. I want to know the answer to it myself. The test that we did was on the Toagawa juniper.
Can you talk a little bit more what you mean by fertilizer cakes?
Oh yeah, organic cake. So this is something along the lines of your canola oil cakes mixed with bone meal, blood meal, things of this nature, feather meal. There are many things that you could put in, even fish emulsion, and you mix it together, and then you make a form, you make a little ball or something like that, or you press it into a mold, and then you dry it. And then it breaks down slowly on the surface. You could even bury it in some cases, or you can put it in a little cup. But high humidity is indicated. You really sort of need that. So they can be really useful in the spring and the fall, even if you're pretty dry in the summer. But I think you're even if you're not raining a lot, you're fairly humid in the summer. Yeah, okay. So it should work pretty well for you. But that's the traditional answer for fertilizing.
We have another question, and that is,
Great.
in the book, you talk about the limitations. This is more general one. The limitations of relying on published science, which doesn't usually care about bonsai specific needs, but you also talk about the slow development of anecdotal traditions. How do you approach evaluating potential new ideas that break from tradition, especially?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's just time. So one of the last step in the scientific method is replication. Other scientists have to repeat what somebody has done. That step, I think, is essential for, and I didn't write this in Bonsai Heresy, but I think this is really key. That step is absolutely essential for the anecdote to be proven useful. Otherwise, it's just a story.
How do you?
It's just another myth. I'm sorry?
How do you decide what's worth testing?
Oh, well, there's so many of us. That's the great thing. I think we can all make that decision on our own. Golly. Well, the question that you just asked is, to me, that's a great question. I want to know the answer to that. And so the tests that we ran in my backyard, that my apprentices ran, we should do that with a whole bunch of different species. But we didn't get around to it. So I encourage everybody to do these tests. And a citizen scientist test, or citizen science test, excuse me, is a test that probably would not impress a scientist, but so in other words, you haven't narrowed all your variables down to just those that you're tweaking, or you're in your experiment, you're asking the question of, but it gives you, in your own backyard, it gives you maybe some guidelines as to what works for you. And then the question would be, okay, can your friend across town or across the country or in another country also find utility in what you've discovered? So I think that we should have some sort of journal where, I mean, scientists have their journals, and every field has their journals, but specifically doing tests like that occasionally. I remember reading, in some of the journals, people who would do various tests, and it was always like manna from heaven. It's just this really interesting stuff to read. But replication is key. Good questions. Yes.
Cheryl asked, you talked about the organics not really getting into the soil, and she's wondering if you've used pelletized organics in tea bags at all, because they seem to be.
Yeah, that's a great technique. I'm sorry to cut you off there. With my big yard, I can't do it. There's just nobody has the time to do it. If you have a small yard, I think that's a great idea. The problem that I have, and that would help a little bit. My problem is keeping them humid enough, because if they're sitting on the surface, as most cakes are. They just dry out, and then they're not really effective. You could kind of bury it maybe, but a lot of older established bonsai have really tight root balls, and there's no way to even think about doing that. So somehow getting the fertilizer penetrated in and fish emulsion was our easiest answer for that. But yes, if you have a small collection, I think that's a great way to go, and it would keep everything a lot less messy, because they will break down and they're a little messy. So yeah. All right, let's move on. We can always cover some questions later too. I was top prune when repotting. This is one that I always did decades ago. I've been doing bonsai almost 40 years now. So when I was repotting, I would prune back on deciduous trees, and I would do the same thing with conifers, and the conifers would often die. And I didn't know why what I was reading was wrong. But with the conifers, and this I had to investigate a little bit what was going on there, but the conifers don't store really much sugar because they're able to photosynthesize almost year round. Some of the real cold hardy ones can photosynthesize below freezing, like spruce. So leaving your top foliage will regrow the bottom, and the bottom, I mean the roots. So never once in Japan did we prune anything, not even a little trim of a conifer at repotting time. And there, the tradition supports, or the other way around, the current science research supports the tradition. And some of those details are in the book. But deciduous, on the other hand, you can do a trim. You can even do a major pruning if you want, because they really do store more sugars. But beware that whenever you do a pruning, you're making the tree young again. It's going to have a big response, and that's going to be a youthful response, not a mature one. So be prudent. So in general, mature bonsai in Japan, so full bonsai, been in a pot a long time, on a normal repotting cycle of a few years, are generally not pruned when they're repotted. All those little apical bugs creating auxin. The auxin comes down. Auxin is your hormone, which grows the roots. The hormones come down the branches, down the trunk, into the root system, and initiates root growth. So the more that you leave, the more roots you're going to grow. Any questions there?
Not yet.
Okay. All right. This is another one I got into hot water a few times with many years ago. And I always put my tiny little sapling in a big pot, and often they just sort of languish there. Maybe some of you have had this experience. Your little sapling is doing just amazing, and it's about 6 inches tall, and you put it into a 5-gallon nursery pot, and it just sort of sits there. And sometimes the first year it doesn't do anything because it's filling out the pot with roots, and then the next year it takes off. But one of the things that you can do to keep the momentum of your small plant going is to keep it into kind of a smaller pot, and don't choke it, but repot it at a more frequent sequence, always into a pot about twice the size in volume, so not inches but volume, of the one that you took it out of. If you do that, you're gonna keep the maximum momentum of the plant. So that's for you growers out there, people who like to play around with little things.
How do you reconcile that, Michael, with the idea that throwing things in the ground causes them to thicken up really fast?
Yeah, and they will thicken up fast. The thing is, it does need to establish roots for a year or two before much happens, and then it can get out of bounds. But if a pot and the ground are actually entirely different sorts of things. If you were to take a cross section of the soil you would see that there are these channels through it all over so it's not just, particle to particle, but there's actually holes in there. And it creates a lot of aeration and whatnot, a lot more than is in a pot. So if we just fill our pots with soil, and put a young plant in there, often that young plant is sitting in kind of mucky soil that it can't dry out. Whereas in the ground, assuming you have reasonable drainage, you can actually grow your plant a lot faster than if you had it in like nursery soil in a 5 or 10 gallon pot, this tiny little thing. So it's funny, it seems like it would be the same, but it actually isn't. Yeah. So the wet dry cycle, the faster you turn that over in a pot, the more it allows your roots to respire. So the roots are taking in oxygen, right? They need to respire as well, just like the cells in the rest of the plant. The roots need that as well. So they're giving off CO2, right? Which is not part of the photosynthetic process. Sorry, that's a different cycle. But when roots are respiring, they're doing the same thing that we're doing. So the more that we can make that turnover happen in the soil, the happier and the healthier, the stronger the roots are going to be. And that's what pumps the engine of the tree.
Somebody has a question, is if you're going to be putting them if you're up potting them, say, to a pot that's twice as big, do you slip pot them or do you prune roots?
Oh, yeah. You probably want to do a little root work so that you don't have any roots that are kind of flat against the side of the pot, whatever it is, or something. You sort of spread out the roots at the very least. Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
And somebody else asked, he has a small sapling spruce showing little growth in a 3-gallon pot. It's a 2-year-old sapling. When's the best time to repot the species?
I'm sorry, what kind of tree was it?
Spruce.
Oh, spruce. Just barely as the buds are beginning to swell. Don't let them get out too far. But don't repot it too early either. So if you take your tree out and you can see root tips growing in the very early spring, then your timing is good. Yeah, but the buds will tell you, they'll start bulging. Yeah. I love this image that Sergio did. This is one of my favorite images of his. It's just hysterical. He came up with all these ideas. We agreed on what chapter would be illustrated, and other than that, I just let him go. And there's no way I would have come up with that. It's just hysterically funny. Okay, here's another chapter. I use all growth enhancers because they must do something. And I think we've all been there, right? We've all tried many strange things. And growth enhancers are, they hold out this carrot of promise, right? that everything is going to be better if we use them. The mistake we often make is that we then put it on everything. And like the bad scientists we are, then we won't know anything, whether it was just what we were doing that year or whether it was growth enhancers or what. So growth enhancers are a little sneaky. There is actually still no evidence supporting the use of Super Thrive or HB101. It doesn't mean that they don't do anything. It just means that nobody's looking into it. I have a feeling, though, that scientists are a little bit leery of doing much with Super Thrive for fear of legal problems. I'm not really sure. Maybe. B1, however, is snake oil. This is that I was also curious about, and I never heard a full story about this, about what it was. It seemed a little strange to me. But so the use of B1, let me explain that first. It has been sold for decades now, and it will be continued to be sold because it's so popular, as a vitamin that helps reduce stress during repotting. And this goes back, and this was fascinating to discover, to the late 30s and early 40s, when a biologist thought that he had discovered a new hormone. and he was working on it for a little bit, and somehow this story got out into Better Homes and Gardens, and they did a little ad. It was a little 8th-page ad. I saw it. I paid for this. I paid for a subscription to Better Homes and Gardens to figure that out, and then I had to pay for the article actually because it wasn't published anywhere. That was written by a science historian or someone about the history behind this thing. So anyway, it mushroomed into this huge thing, and B1 would, you know, grow these huge flowers and do all these crazy things. And Merck, so this company, a pharmaceutical company, signed this guy on, this scientist, to develop something and do more research. And within a year or two, they realized that there was nothing to it. It didn't help anything at all. It certainly wasn't a plant hormone. And so he had to retract that, but it was far too late. This thing mushroomed into probably one of the biggest money makers of snake oil that has ever been. In any event, if you have it, there might be a use for it in something other than bonsai. I don't really know. It is a vitamin, I guess. Anyway, but the takeaway here is that enhancers, most of them, I mean, Super Thrive, many of the stuff you can get in stores for hydroponics, for instance, you know, all of these have nutrients in them, and yet, as this woman that I interviewed, the horticulturalist from Washington State University, she said that these they all do something. The real question is, or most of them do. The real question is, do they do anything any better than normal fertilizers that are cheap? So that's really the question, because many of these are incredibly expensive. Super Thrive, you can $12, $13 for, you know, like 4 ounces of it. I mean, if you want to pay for it, go for it. But it just be aware it might not actually be doing as much as the money you're throwing out there suggests it might. However, humic acid has always been suggestive of pretty good results. So has seaweed. Seaweed has been used as a fertilizer for hundreds of years. That is a thing. And then silicone as a liquid does give some advantages to hardening cells and things of that nature, and maybe of advantage to warding off funguses as well. So there's some interesting things out there, and this is where science can kind of help us out a little bit, is to help us figure out where we're actually spending our money wisely or not. Any questions on this section?
Nope, but we got one on soil when you get there.
Okay. All right, let's keep going. So wire. So for decades, everybody in Europe used aluminum wire, and they scoffed at everyone who was using copper wire, and everybody who was using copper wire couldn't believe anybody would use aluminum wire, and particularly conifers. So it was just this, it was like this fencing match, which for at least a few decades was like between continents, but it was even more than that. The problem is that they really are both good, and they're good for different purposes. So in Japan, they use both. They use copper and aluminum, but they use them for different things. They use copper exclusively for conifers, where the strength of it, the small diameter, subdued color, all of that is great if you're going to put a tree in a show with wire. And it's hard to not have most conifers have some wire on it, because they just become floppy. It's not like a deciduous tree, which holds its branches up. So for the long term, copper is great. It's very innocuous. Aluminum, on the other hand, is really good for deciduous. It has a thicker gauge. It's almost twice as thick as copper for the same strength, but it's shiny, and it's soft, and it's not very good for use with conifers. For any kind of long-term stuff, but for deciduous, it's great because it has a bigger size to it. It's actually makes it a little bit softer. a little softer to the touch on the delicate skin of the deciduous, and it's taken off in just a month or two. I mean, you don't leave wire on deciduous very long unless you're wiring them in the winter, and then you're not going to take them off until they begin growing. So keep your wire, keep your copper and aluminum, just use them for different things. Stay out of the fist fights. Any questions there?
Nope.
Okay. It's very tempting, I know, to hook your trees up to a battery that is turning water on and off, especially on some sort of a morning, evening schedule. And I did this for a while and nothing did very well. At least they didn't flourish. Or, well, I should say a few things flourished and a lot of things did marginally well. And I killed a few things. So if you have a weak tree, watering on a schedule is going to make it weaker. It is not going to make it stronger. Those trees are using water at a different rate than everything else in your yard, usually at a much slower schedule. And if you water them before they need it, you're only going to make the problem worse. And that goes back to the wet-dry cycle that we were talking about. The faster the wet-dry cycle, the stronger your tree is going to be. So on a schedule, it can be helpful when you're at work in the middle of the day and it's 95 out or something like that, and you can't get home to give a water to several plants. That can be useful to have an automatic watering system, perhaps. But in general, train yourself to water by hand, learn when they're drying out. That'll teach you a lot about what's going on with your plant. Your trees are your teachers. So morning watering is a concept that really comes out of the gardening world. And it makes a lot of sense there, right? That's when you would want to water because you get the least evaporation off of, the surface of everything. And you hydrate your trees before the heat of the day, which is a concept you might want to keep in mind for bonsai as well. However, we need to water bonsai when they dry out, and that can be at any time of day. Questions?
I have a question backing up to the wire. Where do you
Yes.
get your copper wire?
Oh, good question. Yes. I used to get it from Jim Gremmel, who's impossible to get hold of now. We're trying to get to the bottom of it, but nobody that I know has been managing to get a hold of him in the last 6 months. We think he's okay, but we've done sort of little tests. We just got a whole bunch of wire from different sources, and there's a lot of nice wire being made. The big difference is price. And how big a roll you want. Many people are creating these really tiny rolls, which I don't like because you almost have to work hard in it to stretch it out a little. So that I don't really like. I am getting my wire from Peter T at the moment, but I think Ryan makes some really good wire and in large sizes. So the rolls are sizable. So he's doing a real nice job. There was a guy who took over from Peter Adams. No, not Peter Adams. I'm sorry. Julian Adams. Do I have that right? Julian Adams on the East Coast. And in any event, that business is continuing, and that wire is pretty nice as well. So there's some pretty good wire around. I think we could use a few more people making wire. I hope somebody listens and starts making wire. Peter T is who we are currently getting wire from, although it's partly because he gives us a bit of a discount being professionals. So yeah.
Back on the watering front, what do you think of moisture meters?
Oh, well, that might be kind of interesting, when your deciduous tree is wilting and your moisture meter is telling you blank, that might be very useful. I have never used them, but some people might find some utility for them. Yeah. They might only be useful if you have one in every pot, though, or can put one there. temporarily. So yeah, I haven't really explored that too much. I try to be a little more intuitive in my watering and try to take many variables into account, such as how sunny it is, how hot it is, how windy it is, and your water meter isn't really going to tell you very much about when that tree is going to dry out. So it might be, you know, one more piece of the puzzle that could be helpful. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, let's move on. This is part 2, aesthetics. All right, so we've talked, or you've probably heard about bar branches and how horrible they are. This is, in general, like all of the ones that I'm about to talk about, in general, they are a problem. On the other hand, you can say 20% of the trees that you see have a bar branch that you might want to leave. And that is maybe when your tree has very few branches. Let's say you have 3 branches, and if 2 of them are bar branches and you cut one off, you have a 2-branch tree. And this is something I've seen a lot in the West, actually, is that we're so married to these guidelines that we don't have trees left by the time we have completed all the guidelines. I mean, there's just nothing worth worth the bonsai anymore. So take them with a grain of salt. Symmetry is definitely a problem with opposite branches. However, look at the gestalt of the tree. So one idea is to keep one branch smaller than the other one. You can move it a little to the back or a little to the front or something like that, and maybe hide the fact that it's coming right out. Also, if you work with really small trees, shohin, even shuhin, the density of the trees in Japan is something that I think everybody should have at least some experience with at some point, because that density on the small size almost assumes you're going to have something that's essentially a bar branch, or an opposite branch, if you want to use that term. So to work at that scale, you're going to almost assume that you have something that, if it isn't a bar branch, it's awfully close. This is part 2, the reply of the royalists. Pocket branches are another thing that, if you go way back in time, which is about 200 years or so, there's this little drawing which describes all of the taboo branches on a bonsai, and a pocket branch is one of them, and so is a bar branch. And, yeah, it's a great little drawing, actually. However, so a pocket branch, just to describe that. So if you have a curve, right, a real tight little curve there, if you have a branch growing on the inside of that, it looks really strange. And that's really, for the most part, true. That's pretty tricky. Unless, again, you have 2 branches on your tree, then you'll have a choice. It's like a collected tree, maybe. But if you widen that out and you have a very slow curve and you have a branch coming from in there, that's not much of a pocket anymore. So there's different ways to look at this. There's a bell curve. Definitely consider balance or gestalt as something that must rule over the rules. Think of so I use the word slower curve. Maybe I should rewrite that, but a straighter tree, one that doesn't have many curves, probably doesn't really have something that we could consider a pocket. So you can you have a lot more latitude with your tree design there. Does that make sense? Any questions there?
Nope.
Okay. Pigeon breast. So this one might need a little description if you're not familiar with it. So pigeon breast is something that is looking very different from what a normal bonsai should, as the guideline says, should look like, which is something that that sort of recedes a little bit from the trunk of the tree recedes from the viewer, and then the very top of the tree comes forward. And that's the crown of the tree. But a pigeon breast would be where from the base, the trunk comes toward the viewer and then away again. And this is something that is considered a no-no. So the pigeon has quite a bold frontal movement. And yet in Japan, you see a lot of bonsai that have pigeon breasts. The thing is, you can't see that because unless you've been over there, because you're seeing them two-dimensionally. And so you can't see that, that something is coming at you. But do consider what you're going after. Be really clear about your intention. If you want to activate your design, or if you think you have a tree that actually shows a front that is far more interesting, maybe a far more interesting trunk line, but it has from that view a pigeon breast, go for the more active trunk line. I mean, that trumps your pigeon breast. A pigeon breast is a secondary rule. There's nothing wrong with the passive framework, the passive guideline of being very sort of opening to the viewer and welcoming. Pigeon breast is simply aggressive is maybe the wrong word, but it activates it, and it's a much bolder sort of feeling. So now and then you're going to encounter a tree where the trunk line is so wonderful from one direction, and yet there's a pigeon breast. Accept it. There's nothing there's no reason you shouldn't choose that as your front. And that might be it's probably still going to be in a minority in your collection. I mean, maybe only 5% of the trees that you encounter will have that. You're probably going to find, if you work with a lot of Yamadori, you're going to find, so I don't know if everybody familiar with that term. Yamadori means collected from the wild. Many of those trees are going to, from the best front, the best, most active trunk line, many of those are going to have a pigeon breast because the trunk lines can be so activated. So, food for thought. Definitely read the tree. Your tree is your teacher, not the book. Any questions there, Carol? Sorry.
I actually have a sort of general question. A lot of the times, the reason we think that pigeon breasts are terrible, et cetera, is because of what we've read. And I won't blame it all on John Naka, because I don't remember if he said anything about pigeon breasts per se, but you know, you read about it, you hear about it, people tell you these rules and everything. Do you have any secrets or ways that we can kind of untrain ourselves from the rules? And you know, not all of us are artists. How do we read?
Yeah. You know, there again, you might, many of them can be seen in 2D. You can maybe get some Kokofu books on eBay. And if you don't want to travel to Japan, it actually, just as a general comment, it can actually be really difficult to understand some of these aesthetic ideas in 3 dimensions in person. So if you look at a Kokofu book, or you look at stuff online or something like that, really important, you know, famous trees, you'll find that many of them are bending or breaking a lot of these rules that we've sort of set up. And that's really interesting. There's a really famous red pine in Japan that has reverse taper all the way down to the base. It's a really powerful tree in person. But that's one example. So, you know, or if you're in a show, if you go to the No-Lander show, if Ryan does the Artisans Cup again, or at the national show, or if you're lucky enough to go to Japan or Taiwan, Thailand has some really good shows. If you're in any of these places, you know, write down the lists in a notebook, walk around and literally take your time and just, for the moment, forget about enjoying the tree and check it off. How many times has this tree met the the design. How many times is it not? The guideline, I mean. If it's a well-known tree, if it's a famous tree, if it works aesthetically, that should give one pause as to how frequently to take these guidelines. I think the guidelines are useful when we're talking about really young trees. The older the tree is, the less and less useful the guidelines are. And we have to kind of forgive the tree to some degree, not supporting our need for them to fit into a guideline. I like to think of them as grandparents. You know, they're not going to conform to our ideas of what a grandparent should be. They're going to be their own version of a grandparent. And so the guidelines, it's a tricky thing. I mean, we are playing around in a traditional art. A traditional art is going to have a few guidelines. Otherwise, it's all chaos. I mean, so do learn these. They're important. I mean, the majority of your trees should not have bar branches. The majority of your trees, probably shouldn't have pocket branches. The majority of your trees probably are not going to have pigeon breasts, but there's going to be that odd tree that I really hope you don't ruin by cutting off that important bar branch or that important pocket branch, or settling for a really bad trunk line because there's a pigeon breast. So it's a mishmash. I think we need to talk about it. I think we need to see more good trees. And I know we're all very young there. There are not many collections in this country, I think, where you can go and see trees that that we consider to be good and yet break all kinds of rules at the same time. That happens. There's some really good collections though. And we should, not just shows, but collections are often just as good or better than shows. Shows happen so rarely. So anyway, if you're traveling, try and see some. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer, but it's a great question. Yeah, we have to do that as a community, though, I think.
We have an interesting question. What are the top 3 public collections in the U.S.?
Oh, great. Yeah, great question there. I think historically the most important is probably the National. A very close second is the Pacific Museum. There's a lot of great trees from our teachers, both here in the States, Canada, and as well from the Pacific Rim, from Japan, Korea, Taiwan, in all of those collections. So those are huge resources. And I think the third one is probably Lake Merritt. Kathy Shainer's curator there. That's a pretty good one to study as well. We're pretty lucky. And there's some new ones that have started up. There's some that aren't as ambitious as those, but some that have some really interesting collections. There's one in Michigan at Ann Arbor, the Matai Bonsai collection, which has acquired some very fine azaleas, which you don't see very often. I think they might be the best azaleas I've seen in a public collection in the States, at any rate. There's a few others as well, but those are probably the top 3.
What about in Japan? We have a member who's going to be visiting Japan.
Oh gosh, go to Omiya. Omiya Village, if you're not there during showtime. Omiya Village will allow you to get into several of the major collections that date back to the 1920s. So go see the Kato garden. You can see also the Hamano garden, where my teacher studied. You can see the Takayama garden, which is the deciduous garden. Those are the three main ones. And then you can get a little map. You can walk around. You're almost always welcome to go in. Definitely ask for permission to photograph trees. Do not just whip out your camera in Japan. And then there are others. My teacher's garden is a long way off from the Tokyo area. It's about a hour and a half, 2-hour Shinkansen ride if you want to go northwest from there. But there's several others. Kimura's garden is in the area. You usually need permission. There is also a man who gives tours. He will drive you around, and this is not easy to do, to actually land in some of the other less visited places. Urushibata's place, for instance, the Shohin Matt Way does other things as well. But and so there's so much to see, but we could get you in touch with that guy who will drive you around, and he speaks English as well. But those collections are great. Yeah. Did I answer the question? I'm sorry if I didn't.
And backing up a bit about the element design, is that you mentioned primary and secondary design elements. Can you describe some of the main primary and secondary and what?
Oh yeah. Yeah, sure. That's a good question. So by primary would be the front of the tree. So that would be trunk line, and then also inclination is sort of paired with that. That's a primary decision. Secondary decisions are the ones that we've been wrestling over here, whether there are bar branches, whether there are pocket branches, whether there are pigeon breasts. How much shari do we see? Things of that nature. These are all secondary decisions. Your primaries, although they might be influenced by some of these, especially if they're significant or they're ugly to the point of not being beautiful. So there's some ugliness that's really very, very attractive. But some of these can make us want to put them in the back of the tree. But in determining the front, so your primary decision and your inclination, the features kind of bifurcate into what is really important to show off for that species. So different species have different features, right? So something like a Japanese black pine, excuse me, should have really good taper. It should have good bark. It should have a good flare. Excuse me, at the Nabari. Japanese maples shouldn't have major scars visible from the chosen front. Has to have a good Nabari. On the other hand, a juniper doesn't need the kind of taper that we assume with a Japanese black pine. Doesn't need a Nabari like a Japanese maple needs to be considered a good tree. It needs a really active trunk line, preferably with some shari on it, movement of the live vein, if at all possible, and movement of the trunk as well. A sinuous, a very active line is important for that tree. That's not so important for a spruce, for instance, which can be ramrod straight up and down and still be an unbelievable specimen. So they're not all the same. And we can't expect one to be the other, and that's definitely going to help us determine the best front and the best inclination. But that's an example of the primary is probably the primary decision, which is paired, right? So it's a front and inclination of the tree. Pot choice comes much later, right? That's it's only primary if you consider it going right into a shell, but that isn't essential in the early phases. That was a good question.
We have a couple of questions about guidelines, rules, etc. And let me finish asking both of them because they're interesting.
Okay.
It sounds like you were saying we have guidelines and they generally will give us the best overall results. The unique trees that may break the rules or have unusual features sometimes are the most dramatic and memorable. The other question is from a different person. How important is it to follow all the rules other than for health and light reasons? When I'm seeing old trees, how many of them really are having perfect branching and how many just like hedge and pruning type? I've seen people on the internet who precisely watch every branch and leaf to perfection, and some who like trim them to profile and they all look the same. Maybe those didn't go together, those questions. But the first one was, we have guidelines and they maybe, are you saying that they give us generally the best results, but there are other unique trees that break the rules?
That's a really good summation. Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah, I use these rules every day in my garden when I'm working with clients. It's only the unusual tree with unusual needs, and those are usually needs of balance, right? I need foliage in one place, and if the only branch to supply that foliage is a pocket branch, I'm going to use the pocket branch. I'm not going to cut it off because there's a rule saying I can't have the foliage where I want foliage for balance, so the tree doesn't fall over visually. I'm gonna use it. So but I absolutely agree with that. It's really going to be the unusual trees where we might dance away from these guidelines. Mm-hmm. And the second one, quick summation.
Yeah, I'll try to rephrase that.
Yeah.
I'm not 100% sure what he meant, but when you look at old, this is my understanding, and it is, if so, it's a good question. When a lot of the times when you see on videos, internet, or whatever, people are kind of trimming every single little branch and leaf, and they're very careful about it. And other people are doing the hedge pruning method. But when you look at a tree out in nature, does it look more like hedge pruning or finely?
Oh,
you know,
when you look at a tree out in nature, yeah. Interesting question. I see. I guess my my answer would be that the careful pruning is going to give you a more natural result than a hedge pruning. I think hedge pruning is a useful technique kind of mid-season when you can't easily see what you're doing, that you would then clean up in the fall. And I think that's the way some people use it. And that makes sense. I mean, there's, you can develop trees. So if you're growing a tree, so it's not a bonsai yet, if you're growing many of the sort of shrub-like things like potentilla or something like that, you can pretty much do a hedge prune on it. And then in the fall, you can figure out the branches that are going, strangely growing back into the tree or whatever. And those are the ones that hedge pruning doesn't help at all with. They're still going to be there. And if you continue hedge pruning every year without that step in between of when it's completely defoliated naturally in the fall, and going back in and pruning out those areas that are not enhancing the design, you could just end up with a mess. So I think it's useful, but I also don't think you're going to ultimately result in a natural habit. In fact, it's going to be very unnatural. Yeah, because if you look out, if you look at a 100-foot, sugar maple or something like that, it doesn't have branches that are going crosswise through the tree from one side of the crown to the other. But that's what you're going to get if you hedge prune. Some of them will grow kind of screwy. So that's my only point, is if you're doing it carefully, you're not going to get any of that.
I think there's a little bit of a misconception that if you do all this carefully, as they practice in Japan, for instance, that you'll get a less natural result than if you do something a little more, letting the tree do its own thing.
Well, that's where where our sense of aesthetics and creativity come into it. We have to still be looking at the tree, which I think going slow does. It's interesting that that it would be, the Japanese who are in the wrong. It would seem to be. I mean, they trim carefully in Taiwan too, and in Thailand, and so I mean, it's bonsai is bonsai. But I think it's the hedge pruning technique is a technique that is used in hedges. We use it in our gardens. We use it for growing bonsai stock, and there's nothing stopping anybody from doing it now and then on bonsai if you have a lot of trees. If you don't have a lot of trees, I don't understand the utility of the technique. It doesn't make sense to me.
Getting away from the whole hedge pruning controversy, I guess what I'm thinking is that when you do all the careful pruning, you are making a natural looking tree. Perhaps, I mean, it depends on what you're doing with that, but that is a way to get a more natural looking tree from a small tree in a pot.
Yeah. And I mean, going slow, of course, doesn't mean you're gonna create naturalness. That you could easily create something unnatural by going slow. so it's still up to us, right? Whether we're going to create something natural or not. With a hedge pruning technique, you're going to create a really nice silhouette, though. Which, if you are going slow, you have to take a little more care to create. So I think going slow it's more difficult. It's definitely more difficult. But you have to ask yourself what your goals are, what your purpose is, why are you doing bonsai is another subset of that question. Whether you're there to spend time with your tree, or whether you're there to do it as fast as possible, or what kind of look you're after. Also, I think that it's easy in either way, either going slow or trimming kind of uniformly. You can easily over prune and create coarse growth. So that's a danger no matter how you go. So you have to choose your goals, for sure. I think one last point I would say is, again, if there's nothing wrong with this sort of uniform cutting if you do it once a year or something, but going back and repruning once you can see everything makes more sense to me. Because if you think of a shoot, it's got a bud here, it's got a bud here, and it's got a bud there, for instance. And if you hedge prune, if you're here, or if you're here, or if you're here, you're going to create different directional growth habits. So when you go slow, the thing that you're doing or should be doing is looking at each bud and determining which direction you want that to grow in. And the only way to create a naturally flowing branch pattern is to look at each bud. If you trim randomly, your tree is going to go all over the place, and it's not going to look natural, as if it was a tree at a distance. So that's my opinion. Okay, let's move on here. S curves. It's funny. So going back to this 200-year-old book I mentioned, you can find a drawing in there of a conifer, and it is an S-y thing. There are a whole bunch of little S curves on it, and it starts out as a big wide curve, and they go tinier and tinier and tinier, and the branches have these S curves in them as well, and none of them are coming off of the inside of a curve, and everything is beautiful. And that's really hard to do, actually. Anybody who can do that, my hat's off to you. It's really tricky. But on any case, the S curve is that was a pine. I mean, this was a black pine. This is what the framework on which you were to design your pine. So if you were to if you do that with everything, including your deciduous trees, everything's kind of look like a pine. So, and there are lots of pines that really, maybe should be considered as something else. So an S curve is a really simple curve. It's easy to appreciate. It's also, strangely enough, it's something that that we do very naturally. You take a shoot and then you put a wire on it and you bend it one way, and then almost everybody, myself included, you bend it the other way. And that's an S curve right there. It's really hard to consciously do something else. I challenge you to do that. Do that as a club. You don't have to use a branch, but do something. You have a wiring exercise where you try to create curves that are not S curves. Once you've explored the difficulty of it, and it is difficult, you'll probably find that you have to be conscious of that every time you begin to bend a branch. Your trunks are going to be more interesting if you're creating young stock, and your branches are going to be much more interesting as well. Unusual movement is far more engaging. Even though if you talk with anybody who actually creates bonsai for a living, who grows bonsai, they'll tell you that an S curve sells 10 times anything else. But we're talking about quality here. We're not trying to make a living, right? So try that exercise. It's a fun one. Deciduous trees in particular, though, kind of have their own genetic stamps, and there's that the S curve is a kind of a construct, right? It's something that we can choose to not do. Any questions regarding S curves, Carol?
I have a comment. Nobody's asked a question, and that is a lot of the times
Yes.
certain imported trees from Japan that they have grown.
Right.
So
Have an S in them. That's right. Yeah, that's exactly what they were doing. They were trying to sell them.
right, making lots of money. And my comment is I always recommend people cut off when it starts to do the other S and grow from down there, or air layer it. But I wondered if you had any great ideas on what to do with a prefab bonsai.
Oh, if you've already got one. Yeah. Try to find a new front. Sometimes you can find something that doesn't have as much movement, but has more interesting movement. So nibble on that one for a little bit. I'm sort of segueing into another chapter that we're going to cover here. But S curve usually is the curve on the tree that has the most movement. And I think this is something that more than we're not necessarily hardwired to, use the S curve as a front, but we're kind of hardwired to use the most movement as a front. We're sort of taught that. And yet I think a more useful and interesting and more accurate way to think about that is more interesting movement. So this is where we're going to be getting a little more aesthetically skilled. Seeing good trees, being exposed to really good material, going to the shows, going to good gardens, step back and check your notebook. Does this tree have an S curve? Does it, this is a very good tree. Does this do that? Yes, you will see them being sold. you will see the grafted pines with S curves for sure. And this is actually, it is the next one I was segueing into. More movement, right? More movement is better. This one here, take a look at the pot over here. I had a phone call with Sergio once. He was working on the last few illustrations. This is one of the last ones, and this pot has a bikini on it. So he called me up and said, "Michael, can I put a bikini on a bonsai pot?" And I immediately laughed, and then I started getting really nervous. And I was like, "Well, I don't know if we should do that. It might be a little too much." And then he paused. He said, "Michael, we're not making a book for kids." So okay, go ahead, do it. So if we think of movement as music, You can't just have the allegro. You can't have this quick salsa beat. You can, but if we insist on every tree having the most movement as possible, we're going to get tired out. The trees, they have a language, right? It's just like a musical notation, and variability creates interest. It creates information. It creates meaning. And you'll find if you do go to Japan, I know I've been pushing shows. You don't have to go to Japan. You could go to Europe. There's this amazing shows over there using some of their native material. Taiwan, if you're down there. Many of the really famous trees in these places have very little movement. And that's something that I hope would give us pause. Sometimes those trees are plants that were found when they were quite old, and they have qualities that are hard to define, and very beautiful. The less we can be guided by rules when we encounter trees like that. Of course, there are formal uprights. That is a style that we talk about, and that's a good example. But there's even collected trees that aren't even formal uprights. They're trees that don't have enough movement to even be a shadow of a myogi, but have some presence that a very active tree doesn't have. So there's a whole bandwidth of language that we can explore regarding movement, and I hope you take the time to do that. Any questions regarding movement?
Nope.
Okay. Well, as you can tell, we had absolutely no fun making this book. Not at all. This was a quote. We'll end with a couple quotes here. A favorite novelist of mine, Carlos Zafón, wrote, "People talk too much. Humans aren't descended from monkeys. They come from parrots." He had a character in this book who was quite a comic, and I laughed out loud when I read this, but but it reminded me of some of the problems that we have in our community, in any community probably, is that we like our stories. We really like repeating stories and making them our own, and then twisting them around a little bit, and then we weaponize them, which is even worse. But but we're very parrot-like, and every now and then I think it pays to slow down and to check in on our stories and the accuracy of these stories. And so that was partly what was behind the book. And then my good friend Gary Wood, who is from Alabama and was the brains behind the propagation and the incredible things they did at Telperion Farm, which is a sad tragedy. They burned up this past fall, and a huge loss. But one of my favorite phrases of his was that doing it right takes a long time. Doing it wrong takes forever. And all of this is vague, right? What is right? But doing it well maybe is maybe a more accurate way of looking at it. But I thought this was a very funny, and very, very true statement for bonsai. Start well, start cautiously, and you will set yourself up well for the long time rather than forever. It was a little burn match in the beginning.
We are getting more questions. So.
Oh, good. Great. Let's do it.
All right. I promised that I would ask the soil question. On page 39, you have a paragraph on organic plants in in development. Do you recommend bark? I assume he means prime bark. In any particular size, anything else you would use?
Okay. So specifically speaking of bark, was that the question?
Well, I think what kind of organic soil are you talking about for baby trees, seedlings, the things that you have in development that you talked about organic?
Yeah, yeah. So I'll just tell you what we do in our backyard. So for growing trees, for growing seedlings, saplings, cuttings, everything, we use 80% bark steer mix, and that's fairly coarse. And then I mix that with 20% pumice. You could use perlite. That works really well as kind of an aerator. It's really light when dry, and it's fairly heavy when full of water. So there's a lot of gas exchange, which again is what we want. It'll create amazing root growth. That's perlite. I know you may have trouble getting pumice, which is sort of a Western surface mined volcanic product. But as far as the bark, coarse is a good thing to keep in mind. You don't want it too big. I mean, not like 1 inch or anything like that, but sort of maybe eighth to quarter-inch size, and then compost it if you can get it. But even that isn't necessary. But a little bit of steer manure is a long-term release. It releases nutrition over a period of about 2 to 3 years, so that's kind of nice. Even though we're fertilizing anyway, it provided some sort of background fertilizer for plants that we're really trying to push fairly hard. So that's what we use back there. It's for my area, it's cheap and grows plants kind of hard. And then I can then transfer those trees into a bonsai pot using a two-step process where I tease out the soil on one side of this organic mix, and I'll chopstick in the volcanic mix that I use. It's sort of an Akadama pumice mix, about a 50-50 mix. I don't know if we're going to get into that, but that's what I use. And then I wait 2 years, and then I'll repot the other side. I'll tease out the other side of the root mass and put in carefully. This is a long process to actually do that, but it's worth it because the plant grows stronger. The reason it grows stronger in the organic mix is that it holds more moisture, and it holds on to more nutrition as well. And that's a chemical attraction kind of thing to the particles. And you chemists out there know this better than I do. But it will grow a stronger tree than your volcanic mix, which at least the Japanese prefer for growing in a bonsai pot, which is sort of your lava, pumice, akadama, volcanic kind of particles. You can use many things to grow bonsai. There's a wide swath of things you can use. In my own experience, I have found that the volcanic particles that the Japanese use have a broader bandwidth in the margins in terms of their ease of use, by a wide range of lifestyles, how often we're watering, and a wide range of species of trees that can be grown in it. It is very, very, very broad. Much broader than if I was to use that organic mix that I just said and then tried to grow everything that I grow in a bonsai pot. In that, I would have a bit of a mess on my hands. The pines would be very unhappy. Spruce would be unhappy. A lot of things would be really, really unhappy in that. So that's a long conversation, but you can grow, at least for the short term, bonsai in a lot of different things. Yeah, that's a long conversation, though. I start this with several chapters trying to describe my own understanding, my own evolution of using different soils. If you name a soil, I've probably used it. I've been doing bonsai since I was 15. It's a long trail of tears. Those might be. I thought when I was writing those chapters, at first they were very difficult chapters to write because I never actually described to myself how to explain all that, even though I had tried multiple times teaching with students. But when you write something, you understand it on a different level. Writing is definitely edifying for oneself. I'm not sure if I answered that question, but there's a lot to talk about there, and I think I'm trying to punt to the book because that's a long, deep conversation, the details of which are really important. So
We've had a lot of back chatter, so I missed a question about the S curve. There was one, and that is talk about spiral curves as opposed to S curves.
say that again. What curve?
Spiral curves as opposed to S curves.
Oh, spiral. Yeah. Oh, the spiral is almost as bad as an S. It has a utility in the fact that there's kind of a push and a pull, which is nice. There's some dimensionality to the trunk. So keeping that in mind is really important. So this is the huge challenge is, when you do this little exercise with each other where you're trying to wire this stick or piece of pipe cleaner or whatever into something other than an S curve, also keep in mind that you don't want it to be flat. It has to have three dimensionality from what you're considering to be a viewing point. So a back and a forth. So in that sense, the spiral is an interesting idea, but don't apply it like a spiral because it's just as boring as an S curve. So good question. That's a good one. Yeah.
You might want to take down your screen sharing so we're not sharing.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. All right.
Oh, there we go.
All right. Now we can see you.
Hello, everyone.
So there is another question. I always hate these questions, but I'll leave it to you. What is your favorite style of tree? Upright, cascade, etc.
Oh, good heavens. Wow. A favorite style of tree. I have a special affection for multiple trunk trees. I think that they're a little more complex. They have sort of conversations amongst themselves, visual things that are kind of fun to. So it's not just a trunk and a bunch of branches, but it's several trunks and then a whole bunch of branches. I find that to be really fun. It's like an orchestra, as opposed to sort of a solo endeavor there. So I enjoy that a lot. Yeah.
Another question. Given that there is more agreement among professionals, I assume he means more recently there's been more agreement, augmented by books like yours, any chance we would have some certification like Japan and the US? Is that even a good goal, do you think?
Oh, yeah. Professionals have been talking about that for a while now. I think it's just sort of a physical mass issue. I think there probably has to be 40 professionals around before something like that makes much sense. Maybe not quite that many, but we're all thinking about it. And it gets tangly regarding, who is a professional, who isn't, and then people get offended or whatever. So that ends up, being a question, and how to resolve that is something that is a little beyond me, but people are talking. For sure. There is interest in that. I've had conversations with many people. Colin Lewis and Bill Valvanis tried to set something up almost 10 years ago, I think. So, we have now I can see the chat. It's more of a curriculum. I'm sorry. What was?
We got a lot of things that are, there's so much circular.
Oh, I see. Let me.
Sorry, I was just clarifying. That was my question.
Okay.
I mean, less so who is a professional, not, but more a standard curriculum that is out there. Because people kind of can say whatever right now.
Yeah, that's a really good question. In fact, so in Japan, there's a test. I mean, to get your certification after being an apprentice, you take this test. Yeah, it's sort of standardized in a way, or at least they make an attempt to do that. The interesting thing is that piece of paper doesn't say you're a master. It says you can now teach bonsai, which I think is pretty cool. It's pretty neat. A few people have gotten that. I think Kathy Shaner got it. I think Boone has it. Bjorn might. I don't know. Ryan and I did not, I don't believe. A whole bunch of people did. Most people didn't. I think Matt did. Tyler did, I think. So anyway, it's something that's, and you got to have it if you're going to do anything in Japan. If you're not going to do anything in Japan at the moment, it doesn't mean anything. But yeah, as far as curriculum goes, that would be an important part of any kind of professional association, I would think. Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question.
We have a bunch of miscellaneous questions, and one was just a clarification when you talked about perlite. We can get pumice, by the way, we order it all the
Great.
time, but
It's good. Yeah.
if somebody was asking for clarification, you meant perlite in place of pumice.
You can, absolutely. And that's available nationwide. It's great stuff. It floats, which is, you'd only want to use it in a nursery pot where you got an inch of space before your soil, because it's going to float every time you water it. But it's wonderful. It creates a great aeration to whatever else you're putting into your media.
And
Yeah.
someone else asks, have you ever grown anything in sawdust? They had heard sawdust works, but never tried it.
I haven't. Well, no, I've tried everything, as I said, but yeah, I think it's useful mostly for healing in. So if you were to collect something and then you didn't want to put it in a pot right away, maybe until, that spring or something like that, you could put it on the ground, you could throw some sawdust over it and roots will come out. But I think that would be something I'd be really hesitant to put in a pot, because it's going to get soggy really quick. Bark is better. It won't decompose as fast. Sawdust is going to decompose really fast for you and create some problems. But for the short term, a lot of things are helpful and useful. Yeah.
When you transition from the organic soil for little baby trees, at what stage of development did you then start putting them into inorganic soils to make bonsai?
When the form is suggesting that it only needs refinement after that. So that could be at any age, could be at 10 years, could be at 15. Yeah, 8. For a Chochibai, it's about 8, maybe somewhere around there. But it tends to be more of a structural question. It's like, is this tree ready to be in a bonsai pot? If it is, then I start the transition into the other soil.
We've been taught, and I don't think you were talking about it, but maybe where you would repot a conifer by doing a wedge or half bare rooting. Do you do that on deciduous trees at all, or just conifers?
It's mostly conifers. I tend not to teach bare rooting techniques, because I like to do that in person with people. That's a very dangerous technique if it's mishandled, particularly if the reintroduction of soil is mishandled. If you have a 3-year-old seedling and it's a deciduous tree, you're probably not going to get into too much trouble. But other than that, if it has a complex root system, try to do that it's a lot like going out to collect an old conifer or something like that. You want to do that with somebody who's done it before. Yeah.
We have a question about myth number 7. About
oh dear, what's that one?
potting azaleas after blooming. So here's the question.
Oh, right.
Talked about the Satsuki azalea and then repotting and letting bloom only once every 3 years. Can you share when to safely hard prune if you are repotting before blooming when in the development stage?
Sorry, say that again. If you're,
we'll figure that. Okay.
Yeah.
Can you share when to safely hard prune if you are repotting before blooming when the tree is in the development stage?
Oh, I see. Yeah. Okay. Hard pruning is usually done in March. Although that might be a little different for you. It might be April, early April, something like that. But it's springtime. And that is generally around the time that you would repot. You can do both at the same time. Be sure you have a really vigorous tree though. Generally speaking, I would do that on opposite years. So you're repotting and then you're leaving at least 12-month period before you do a hard prune, or the other way around. But doing it at the same time is something I am a little cautious to recommend, again, because of just subtleties of technique and how you can get into trouble with that. If you have a greenhouse, if there's a lot of things that go into success. But you're that's a broadleaf evergreen. So if you're doing a hard prune and you're also cutting your roots back, it can work. But and I hope I'm answering the actual question. But the point I want to make is that with any kind of evergreen. So I was making a point of conifers where you don't, not in that chapter, excuse me, but I'm trying to make a comparison with the conifer in that you don't prune the same time that you repot. And with a broadleaf evergreen, it's a considerably different plant than a conifer, but yet the top does regrow the bottom and vice versa. It is an evergreen. So, yeah.
I have another question.
Mhm.
What do you consider your biggest mistakes, aka learning opportunities?
Oh, they're ongoing. Oh, wow. I think they were probably in the repotting, the early years of bonsai for me in the repotting. I had one book, and it was the Sunset Garden book. I think the Naka books. No, I don't think they were quite out yet. I think this was in the. Maybe. When did they come out? Was it the early 80s? I can't even remember now when he wrote his book.
You still have
The
Sunset
first
book?
edition.
You still have your Sunset book?
Yeah, that was the only one that I had. And
You have it now?
what's that?
You still have it now?
I think I still do. Yeah, that's still in the library there at the studio. Yeah, the original. Thank you. 1973. Thank you, Tim. Okay, great. Yeah, no, that had come out. Yeah, I didn't have his books. So that was the only one that I had. There was a Sunset Garden book. And you had to interpret a little bit. And it was like a lot of the books at the time. I mean, at the time, I think Naka probably had the best book out there then, if that's how early it was. And I made plenty of mistakes. I killed a lot of things doing well. I don't follow rules very well either, and a lot less back then. I was an explorer. I wish I'd taken better notes because I don't have a very good memory either. So I was kind of shot both ways. But when you lose things, especially later in my bonsai career, when I was getting a little bit, what was this? Your blog is like a very big, like a very big notebook. Funny. Yeah, notebook of mistakes. When you lose trees that are really special to you, you learn fast. It's like any traumatic, grief loss kind of experience. So, that's my clearest answer to that question is when it gets personal, you start learning pretty quick. Or at least you try and seek some answers so you don't do it again. Do you want to keep reading these, Carol, or should I?
If you prune in the fall, can you repot in the spring, or should you wait?
Okay. It depends upon how strong a prune is. If it's a normal yearly, moderate or light prune, you can definitely do that. So in other words, you're not taking off huge branches or things of that nature. If you take off a lot of wood, you want to let the tree regrow. Yeah, maybe just have that be a general rule. Trying to separate your repotting and your strong technique work by 12 months. I mean, that's a general guideline, especially I would say, given where you folks are living, because you have a short growing seasons, right? 3 months max, right? So the tree doesn't have as much time to build a response as I do. I've got 7 months of growing season or something like that. So it's I can do a lot of things here. So we just had a comment about the blog. You know, I'm doing a lot of things here that I hope other people are not doing because of the climate in the Willamette Valley. So for instance, where I might do a full conifer design in late summer and repot the tree in the spring in March, I could get away with that here. Whereas for you, you might want to wait 18 months before, let it go through growing seasons, because your growing seasons are pretty short. So anyway, just thinking.
They're
Just
5
thinking.
months, not 3.
I'm sorry, what's that?
Our growing season is 5 months, not 3.
5 months? Wow.
Compared to year 7, we're short a month on each side. We can talk more about that later.
That's an awful lot longer than I thought. Wow, we're talking frost to frost?
Yes.
That's impressive. Okay. Wow. Yeah, that's pretty good then.
So here's another one. Okay, from myth number 18, grow
Oh dear.
size branches low on the trunk. Is there too high a place to grow the sacrificial branch up top so that you read it, you can read, so that the oxen is bulking up the apex and not getting the girth down to the trunk?
Oh.
Hope you follow that better than I did.
Too high a place. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So if you were to grow a sacrifice branch somewhere on the trunk itself, too high. Yeah. You can definitely have a problem with bulking up the apex. But your trunk is going to bulk at the same rate. So this is where you want to have the structure of your trunk developed before you put it in a bonsai pot and give up the idea of sacrifice branches. So this is sort of timing. So when you start your well, we were saying apex, but you might want to say leader, and then so complete your trunk height and taper before you get too involved with your branching. Having said that, this is going to sound like I'm contradicting myself, but start your branching as early as possible so that your branching has the same feeling of age as your trunk. It's very common in this country, through anywhere outside of Japan, except for maybe Taiwan is the only place I've seen it done really well, in some parts of Europe. But where you have this old trunk and you have these very young branches, we don't do that well. So that's something we really have to change. So an idea to think about there is to grow your trees a little more naturally, in the sense of using your lower branches. So here's how your lower branches, using those to thicken up the bottom trunk, but not as if they're sacrifice branches, simply cutting back to another branch, a branchlet on that branch, and growing branch taper. But using this branch sequentially, cutting it back so that you can create a natural taper in your trunk. So even if you're in a bonsai pot and you think, gosh, I want more taper here, use your lower branches to do that and continue to cut back on them, create taper, and you're going to have an older looking tree and a more natural one. So you don't have to give up the idea of of sacrifice. You just don't use the word sacrifice. Use a different developmental idea. I hope that made sense. Sorry. I have some blog posts about that concept. Yeah. So a couple more chats here.
Yeah, somebody pointed out that in the southeast of Minnesota, we have 160
Ah.
growing days, but in the north, the Iron Range, 90 days.
Oh, obviously I was thinking of the North. No, I think I don't know. Things are so different. I grew up in upstate New York where it was, it was only about 3 months, maybe a little bit more than that, but it was cold. It's just, and there have been some weather pattern changes. So we had another from Tim. People get to the apex too fast. Yeah, shades lower branches by the time the bottom thickens enough, the apex is too thick. Yeah, that's cooking too many dishes. Yeah, that's a really good point. It is very, very hard, and you have to be a little more aggressive on your canopy. I think the top half of the tree, because if it is a tree and not a shrub, it's going to want to grow stronger than the bottom. So grow out those longer branches. The bottom branches longer, so that they get a lot of light, and so that you thicken them up, and then you cut them back, and be a little more aggressive in your pruning of your top. Yeah, it is a tricky dance. Absolutely.
You won't see it now because there was a long back chat going on, and that was, you had talked about the national, I'm sorry, we're getting all mixed up as to the display in DC, the US National Arboretum, correct? And the national show.
Right,
so
yeah.
Wonder maybe you could straighten people out because people were typing and getting confused.
Yeah, sorry about that. The National Arboretum is a great collection to visit, for sure. That was sort of my first choice, and the three followed very closely by the Pacific Museum, wonderfully curated by Aaron Packard with a lot of history. That collection was developed primarily by its first collector, David DeGroat, who I think did a marvelous job choosing trees from a wide bandwidth of our great teachers throughout the Pacific Rim. So the national show is our national show in Rochester, which has some really significant trees showing up in it. The quality is improving year by year, set up by Bill Valvanis. I think he's doing a great job and a great service. And if you can get out to that show when that starts up again, I think it was a virtual show this past year, but I think he's planning on a full show again in the future. But that's a great one. It's I know that's still a bit of a long leap for you folks, but if you haven't been to that, that's a good one to visit, for sure.
To go from the sublime to the mundane, I actually had saved a question of my own, and that is, could you talk a little bit more about the three types of dormancy, the endodormancy, the ecodormancy, and the
Oh my gosh. Okay. I'm going to have to get my own copy out here. What page are we on? Boy, this is going deep in. Yeah, these are tricky. Where are we? Yeah, dormancy is tricky. I mean, there's things we can write on the page about it, and then there's how the plants are actually responding to the environment, and that's where black pine gets confusing. Just as a general statement, it can be really confusing, because if you're looking at the cold hardiness of a black pine, and you look at the cold hardiness of a white pine, Japanese black pine, Japanese white pine, it's identical. It's 15. So that's your root kill temperature. So why then do we have problems with black pine? And that's because of dormancy issues. Is that the tree is actually reading the environment differently the black pine is from the white pine. The white pine is probably going dormant. This is the way I understand it. I don't know. We haven't asked the tree this, but this seems to be what's going on, is that the tree is because it's a mountain tree, it's probably reading clues a little differently than the black pine, which is a low elevation shoreline tree. And so the black pine can get damaged at the same temperature, whereas the white pine is already in dormancy. So for the reference of these three types of dormancy comes from a little technical tidbit sidebar here. We one of these chapters on dormancy. Endodormancy is one of these types, and this is when we have a tree that is in a cold region such as yours, and then you have some of these winter jumps in temperature. So I remember in upstate New York, sometimes it would bump into the 60s or something in the middle of January, and this type of dormancy, the endodormancy, protects the tree from going out of dormancy when it knows it has another 2 months of really damaging frosts ahead of it. So that's an adaptation for that. And then there's ecodormancy, so that if you have a really long winter, the tree doesn't say, okay, March 15th, I'm waking up, regardless what the weather is doing out there. It's actually kind of reading the weather so that it can keep dormant later. And then paradormancy isn't really related to cold, but it's more related to what initiates buds, so your lateral buds, and that's where if you cut off your big end bud, right, that produces a lot of oxygen, which tends to limit the lateral buds. If you cut that off, the dormancy of these lateral buds is released, and then they can start growing. So those are fairly confusing, and I didn't really go into that in the book here, but that was chapter 11. Yeah. Chapter 11, temperate trees need light in winter. And that was confusing. I did a fair bit of research for that chapter. Side comment.
Side comment, yeah.
Oh, Tim, thank you. I'm glad that you enjoyed the index. Oh, God. I had a lot of fun with that. Yeah. Any other questions come up? Doesn't seem like it.
No, but I have another question is, how are you going to update this book? Because we know that 2 years from now, you're going to have totally different ideas about some of the sections.
That's absolutely true. Yeah, I had fully assumed that when it was published in the spring, that in 10, 15 years, I'm going to have to do a revision because we'll have some new information. And I hope some of you will give me some of that information. I've already had a few scientists write me, and I think there's a couple of things that we might change. Mostly, some people don't really seem to know the answer to the one about the trees in LA. That was interesting. I've asked several horticulturalists, and they actually couldn't give me an answer, but they did think I was onto something. Not that they, haven't puzzled over this themselves. It just doesn't seem like science is quite up to a complete answer on that one, but there's some interesting stories out there. I mean, they have tried to grow apples in Taiwan, for instance, and they just don't do well. And it seems to be a number of different factors, because once a tree gets weakened, then you have a whole bunch of diseases that can come in and complicate things. And then pretty soon it's really hard to figure out what's going on. So it's not simple. There's also people in LA that appear to be, I just heard a story of somebody who's refrigerating trees, and so far that has been successful in the winter. So, there might be some benefit there, but it doesn't explain the story that I came up with it, that we encountered. So just for those of you who haven't read it, there was a collection down in LA that I was taking care of, and a whole bunch of the trees are kind of falling apart. Temperate trees. And so we brought them up in Oregon, but we brought them up in like May, and they did great. In like 2 months, they were totally different trees, full flush growth, everything, but they didn't go through a winter. So that's what made me really question the wisdom of, or the reality maybe even of a plant needing to go through a winter in order to be healthy in a mild climate. It seemed to be other things in addition. So anyway, yeah. For any of you, thanks, Carol. For any of you who are just starting out in bonsai and hardly know what I'm even talking about, I admit and I apologize that many of the chapters in this book assume some mistakes and tripping and disasters and a little bit of experience in bonsai. If you're a newcomer, welcome. One of my colleagues and good friends just wrote, I think, the best introductory book on bonsai, and it's called The Little Book of Bonsai, Jonas Dupuy, and that also came out this year. It's a great little book. It actually is a little book. It's like 70 odd pages, and he made it so concise, and it was fun. I was able to read a draft of it, and I got really excited because I didn't think we had a book like that yet. So I finally have a book to recommend. Please read that. I think it's great, and it's a great review for any of you who have some experience as well.
Cheryl is holding up a copy, or Jumi was. One of you were. Jumi.
Great.
Both books.
Excellent.
So,
yeah.
Yeah.
And you can get that anywhere. This is
Well, I was going to say I saved on shipping by getting them both from Stone Lantern.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah,
All right.
they came in the same.
All right. I apologize. My book isn't available everywhere. I was so well taken care of by Wayne and his interest in supporting this crazy adventure, the heretical adventure. Yeah. Maybe one last story, and then I'll let everybody go. But this was such an unusual experience. I happened to mention in a conversation that I was writing this book, and he had been the distributor for Post Dated for as long as I've been selling it, and we've had a great relationship over that. And then so he asked whether I had anybody to publish that, and I said no. I was gonna self-publish Heresy just like I did Post Dated, and he said, well, tell me more. And so we started talking, and then he offered to pay for the production of the book, for the printing of the book. And I paused, and I wrote him back. This is all by email, and I wrote him back and said, let me get this straight. I'm a self-publisher, and he knew that. So you're telling me that you're going to front the costs of the printing of the book, and I get to keep my rights? And he said, yeah, sure, this is going to work out great. I was like, you got to be kidding me. So anyway, I've told this to other publishing friends, and they said they've never heard of such a story. So anyway, it's been a great. So we just are in business together with this book. So it's been a fun adventure. Anyway, I those of you who haven't read it, it's at Stone Lantern, and thank you for the chance to talk with you all. This has been fun. I've enjoyed the Zoom experience and getting to chat with people that I've never met and some old friends.
A plug for your Bonsai Wire podcast.
The podcast. Oh, that's a new deal. Yeah, that's less than a year old. Those of you who listen to podcasts, or even people like me who have hardly ever listened to a podcast in their life, and yet I'm part of a podcast. We have a podcast. And I say we, colleagues of mine and I. So there's 4 of us are running a podcast, which in itself is a little unusual, and it makes it an awful lot of fun. But it's Jonas Dupuy, author of Little Book of Bonsai and the great website Bonsai Tonight, which has a great blog and store. My recent graduated apprentice, Andrew Robson, who has a deciduous themed garden that he's just setting up right now, and John Eads, who is my current apprentice and will be staying in the area in Portland and growing. He's going to be a grower, supplying us with younger material. So the 4 of us have a podcast called bonsai wire. Hope you enjoy that.
Thanks so much. If people want to stick around, I mean, Michael, you don't have to, but if other people want to stick around, feel free to unmute, and I'll stand by for.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. It was great.
Thanks.
Super. Thank you. Great.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, David.
You don't
Bye
have
now.
to go. You can
Thanks.
stay and chat if you want.
You're a little
I'll
wild at
stay
night,
just
though.
for a couple minutes. Hi, everybody. Hi, Tim. Oh, is that Tim? Hi. I didn't even know who you are. I just kept seeing these messages come up to say Tim. Thank you,
You didn't need
Chris.
to read them all, by the way. They're just like side commentary. You know?
Yeah, our chats are not.
Yeah,
But-
right. Oh my
That was
gosh.
awesome. Thank you.
Great. I'm glad you enjoyed. It was fun to put together. Of course, I had great illustrations from Sergio. We have this mad plan. Of course, anything dealing with Sergio and myself is going to be just a little bit off. But we're going to create T-shirts or postcards or hats or something with some of the illustrations that he created for Bonsai Heresy.
Are you going to meet him first?
I've never met him. That's right. I've never met the guy. That has to happen. I know. Definitely. Oh gosh.
You should put up a store. You could make some money on those T-shirts, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Just one of those stores where you don't have to do any of the work.
Yeah, I was thinking of that. Yeah. How many? Let me take a little, if you don't mind, just shout out. Yes, you would get one of these weird paraphernalia.
Absolutely.
Maybe
Several
not
of
the
you.
one with
Okay.
the
Oh, yeah.
bikini.
Not the one with the bikini.
Yeah.
I have to add it to my bonsai collection T-shirt.
Sorry
you know?
about that.
Nice link.
That one
I
is
like
not chosen as no, that wasn't one of our favorites. I thought it was the most far out. We
Tim,
have.
What were
Sorry.
you just showing? Tim, what was that shirt you were just showing?
So this is a Zelda video game, trimming the Deku Tree, which is like one of the main characters in the video game.
Oh gosh.
I have an entire collection of bonsai shirts, so I absolutely need to add this.
Where did you get that, Tim?
What's that site? Redbubble, I think it's called, where you can
Okay.
buy
Yep.
like, yeah. There's
Nice.
lots of great ones.
Yeah. Yep. So you'll have a lot of competition, but we'd all buy one.
Yeah.
Cool. Does anybody want to sell it?
Well, I mean, if you just post it on Redbubble, you don't even need to set up a shop for yourself. You just post the design, and then I think you get some royalty from that or something like that.
Yeah, I've heard that can be pretty easy.
Jonas,
Yeah.
store.
It's like a trade-off between how much work you put into making sure that they've got good quality and things, and how much they'll actually pay you as the copyright owner for it. So
Okay.
that's the trick, is like, how much time do you want to spend on making T-shirts instead of bonsai?
And do you like Redbubble too, Jimmy?
I haven't used Redbubble, so
Okay.
Dazzle.
I've never heard of it.
yeah,
so
yeah, I've
that
used
one's new to
Dazzle.
me.
And, yeah,
They're not bad.
I think it's pretty good, but I mean, if you're trying to get rich, then you're probably not in bonsai anyways, right?
No,
So-
we're here to have fun. I don't know anything about getting rich.
Yeah, exactly.
That's that's not on this page.
That is an awesome McMansion you have there, by the way.
I was going to ask for a tour of the tiny house. Is this a new development?
We have time
in your
for a
life,
tour,
or how
or-
long-
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I don't know. I could give you a little walk around.
Good stuff.
I got this microphone. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Like this. I got this microphone is what we use for the podcast. All four of us got the same microphone.
Very fancy.
We look very fancy, and we don't even know what we're doing. So let's see. There's a big window behind me. That's a 6 by 7 foot picture window.
That's impressive. There are real houses that don't have windows.
This is a cabin, but this is also strip lighting. This is one of the doors that is a French door, and here's the other one. So I have 2 French doors in this place. So when I open that up, it's just sort of like being in a breezeway with a roof over my head. It's a cabin. It's simple. This is a single level plan. I'll turn around. There's the rest of it. That's about it. So here's the kitchen. There's my kombucha waiting for me to finish that up. And over here is the wood stove. I don't know if you guys can see that.
Mm-hmm.
There's a little wood stove. And there are my axes. Anyway.
So the wood stove is your heat then?
What's that?
Wood stove is your heat?
Wood stove is my heat. That's right.
All right. And then I saw a sink. You have running water?
I do. I have a sink, and let's see, here's the bathroom. So here's the shower stall with the glass panel. That was kind of fun. There's no way I can describe this, but this was not an insert. I took 2 pieces of vinyl, what was it, acrylic, and I bent them 2 4x8 sheets, and I slipped one over the other and created my own shower stall. I hated those fiberglass things. Anyway, there's some strange cabinetry that I had built. This is all this whole cabinet structure under the bed frame. I don't know if you guys can see that. There are pull-outs underneath the bed where the books are. So the books that's a false front on the books. So every little space in a tiny home has to mean something.
No, that's fantastic.
Oh, nice.
That goes back 3 feet, and then in the back, the very back, I have long-term storage back there, which I can pull up, and then there's some here as well. There's these things pop up here. Anyway, there's storage everywhere. I still haven't filled it all, actually.
So that's where you keep, that long-term storage is where you keep your Halloween and Christmas decorations?
Yeah, that's kind of the idea. Right.
You used to have all the storage at the house, though. It's kind of cheating.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, this is a complete lie. Don't believe any of it. When I was in my 20s, I saw a photograph of Gandhi's worldly possessions at the time of his death. It was I don't, have you ever seen this? There's a picture of a pair of glasses, a notebook with a pen, some slippers, a few books, a bowl, and then the little figurines, speak no evil, see no evil, hear no evil. Yeah.
Hear no evil. Yeah.
And that was just about it. There was nothing else there. And for a decade or so, that was like, I took that as sort of a guide, that I wanted to do that. That's what I wanted. That's what I wanted to be.
He did have
my 20s, and as this went on, it wasn't happening. I was getting more and more things, and I remember sometime in my early 30s, I had a conversation with a friend, and I was really frustrated, because I was accumulating all this stuff to be a functional human in society, and and somewhere in that conversation, I realized that he didn't live, the way I was living. He lived in an ashram. He lived,
right.
While those things were what
communal property
owned,
yeah,
it wasn't everything that he used, and those were communal belongings, and so that it totally changed a lot of my ideas. So anyway, long story short, yeah, all those things are for the business out there at the studio property, and I have I kind of have a future plan of reciting this someplace where I'm actually, I don't know, maybe part of a community or something. I didn't design it with the idea of being a part of a tiny home community or anything like that. I have actually very little connection with other people doing the tiny home stuff. I wasn't really involved with any of that, even when I started designing these. So anyway, I live on the edge of suburbia, actually, in this little side yard of someone else's house.
So when you took this meeting, did you assume that we would invade your home, or are you never taking this club again after this? You know?
Stop recording.
I didn't.
Well, all the secrets are out now, Mike, so you might as well, you know.
I mean, you should have checked with Matt or Tyler or any of these guys before you took this gig. I mean, we're an odd club.
The reason I thought you were in the closet was because of the room that you're using as a study now in the house is the boiler room closet, right?
Oh yeah, the laundry room.
Yeah,
sure, yeah.
that's
Yeah,
what
that's right. I see. Yeah, right. Yeah, I suppose I could have, but since getting good internet here, all my programs I'm running just from here. Yeah.
And I think
I know a lot of people, you know, work most of their careers to be able to work at home. And for whatever reason, it didn't work for me. When I was working at the studio, what I call the studio residence, it sounds very snooty. It's a stupid little suburban home. But it didn't work for me. I could never escape from work. I'm not a workaholic. I felt guilty when I wasn't working. It was that kind of a thing. So I never really rested very well there. And for whatever reason, living apart from work just works so much better than me. But I'm only like a 30-minute bike ride away, so it's not that bad. Anyway.
I will say, like, a side note with, you know, the COVID pandemic and being at home more, I do think that a lot of you know, bonsai professionals are seeing that having time at home is very important. So I wonder if that's going to change the dynamics of teaching and, you know, the whole fly everybody around the country kind of thing, you know.
I think you're onto something, Tim. I haven't traveled much for years now, but I sure hope I can, you know, be a little more present with clubs, organizations like yourselves doing something like this, because I probably won't travel. I'll continue doing what I've been doing.
Well, honestly, I guess my opinion is that, you know, allowing people like you to do the things that you do actually benefits all of us, because you have time to work on your trees and learn things, whereas instead of going around potting everybody else's trees all the time, you know what I mean?
You know, that's a really astute comment. I think back in, especially back in, you know, John Naka's day and a few decades, you know, following that, to be a bonsai professional, you were always on the road. And I think you're really onto something, because I have a feeling that their own knowledge kind of stagnated. I don't know that for a fact, but it kind of did in the early years of my professional life. When I came back from Japan, I was doing a lot of traveling because I had to survive. I can tell you, I didn't learn an awful lot then, except for some of the experimentation I was doing in my clients' yards. But I wasn't seeing the day-to-day stuff, which is where some of the deeper lessons.
Ask your doctor about the pill first prescribed for RA more than
That's a mistake.
folks, they don't have
even your experimentation though, like, because you weren't doing the aftercare yourself and you're doing it on clients' trees, sometimes it's hard to know if those experiments were even valid necessarily.
Yeah, that's a good point too. Yeah. I think it was one of the reasons I was sort of interested in creating a community here, which see, at the time I didn't, you know, the Bonsai Village idea didn't have apprentices in the idea then, but now they seem to kind of want to stay here, which is cool. I really like that. So that's sort of creating a community of people who not only can help one another and sort of learn from one another, but many of those people are also choosing to not travel. Like John is going to be a grower; he has no interest in traveling at all. So that'll be refreshing.
talk with people who serve with
Who
integrity.
are we listening to?
I was gonna say we need a host here.
I'm going to mute people one at a time to figure
You want
this
to
out.
give them a chance. If you can say something different and send them on a different path, you come to work. Join
And
me.
I will say that also part of this, I mean, I guess a silver lining also is that I think there is a lot better online and print education out there, so that maybe clubs can facilitate the role of some of the basics, allowing other people to do more specialized work like what you're doing, you know.
Hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah, specialization is a big part of this. Absolutely, because there's some people who love traveling and love speaking, and they're really good at it, and they're inspiring, and we need that too.
Yeah.
Also,
But there's a really high learning curve to bonsai that you have to get through in order to really get to that
there
end
is.
level stuff. You know?
You're absolutely right. There really is, and kudos to all of you for your courage. it's a long one for sure, but I hope we can help one another too. Certainly, media really helps. I mean, John Naka didn't have this, what we're doing right now. That was a different world back then. There were a lot of limits. Yeah.
Michael, who had you mentioned that was the azalea that had a very nice azalea garden?
Oh, if you can get to Michigan, Ann Arbor, it's the University of Michigan there in Ann Arbor has a garden called the Matai Garden, and they have a bonsai collection there.
Okay.
And actually, the curator there, Carmen, is going to be my next apprentice, actually, starting this spring.
Nice. Very
Yeah,
nice.
she's bringing her whole family out here. It's great. She's got a
Wow.
6-year-old or seven.
That's commitment.
And yeah, she's never lived anywhere but Michigan. She says it's going to be a great adventure for her. So, but she does a great job there, and they have particularly some really nice azaleas, as well as a few trees from other important teachers from that area, like Jack Weichel and others.
Sure. Yeah. No, thank you.
Yeah, sure. All right. Well, I think I'm going to take off unless there are any final questions or anything. So I'm going to have some dinner. I guess you guys must be pretty late by this point.
The night's just getting started where I am, but
oh my gosh,
It's my bedtime, so
I know you're an early to bed person, so
yeah, me too. Thank you so much for everyone.
Yeah, thanks,
Thank you,
Michael.
Michael. It was wonderful.
Have a good night.
Thanks. See you.
Lionel, what are you working on? What is that?
I am making guides for wire gauges. Aluminum, the metric guides, the aluminum wire.
Oh, I didn't know you made those.
I am making them.
Because I use them a lot.
I got one of these in metal from Jerry Nelson years and years ago, and also for metric, but also one for the copper wire, which of course
I have that for knitting.
Yeah, sorry.
I have it for knitting.
And so, but I teach the Northwest Pastured schools, and I keep telling them, you need this size wire and so on and so forth. And it dawned on me that they don't actually know, because they're each got small samples of these wire. And so they don't know what sizes they are. So I'm making these up so they can go to the school.
Well, Lionel, first of all, I use a lot of I think it's 1.3, no, 1.5
1.2.
1.3 or 1.2 and 1. I can't remember what they are, but there's 3 different odd sizes that you can buy, and it totally throws me off. This is just an aluminum. Throws me off when I try to use Jerry's metal gauge there.
Yeah, right.
So